October 15th, 2023. Three young recruits at Fort Benning couldn't stop snickering as they watched an elderly man in a faded, decades-old army uniform shuffle through the base commissary, his worn patches barely visible against the sun-bleached fabric. They had no idea that the quiet veteran they were mocking had a chest full of decorations locked away at home. But would one small badge on his uniform be enough to silence their laughter forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun beat down on Fort Benning's main commissary parking lot as Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway pulled his weathered Chevy pickup into a spot near the entrance. At 72 years old, Marcus moved with the deliberate pace of someone whose body had been tested by time and circumstance. His hands, still steady despite the years, gripped the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary before he cut the engine. He debated whether to wear the uniform today. It hung in his closet like a relic from another lifetime. The fabric thin from countless washings, the olive drab color faded to something closer to sage green. The patches were frayed at the edges, and the name tape had started to peel away on one corner. But today was different. Today was the anniversary, and wearing it felt like the right thing to do, even if nobody else would understand why. Marcus stepped out of his truck and adjusted his garrison cap, smoothing down the front of his jacket. The uniform still fit, though it hung a bit looser on his frame than it had 50 years ago. He locked the truck and made his way toward the commissary entrance, his gait betraying the old injuries that had never quite healed, a slight favor to his left leg, a stiffness in his right shoulder. Inside the commissary, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as shoppers moved through the aisles with their carts. Marcus grabbed a basket and headed toward the produce section. He didn't need much, just a few essentials to get him through the week. Living alone had simplified his shopping trips considerably since Martha passed 3 years ago. Near the cereal aisle, 3 young soldiers stood clustered together, their uniforms crisp and new, their faces smooth and unmarked by the weight of real combat. Private First Class, Tyler Brennan was the tallest of the group, with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly tested. Beside him stood Private Cody Matthews, stockier and darker-haired, constantly checking his phone between comments. The third, Private Jesse Hartman, was lean and wiry, with nervous energy that kept him shifting his weight from foot to foot. Tyler noticed Marcus first. He nudged Cody with his elbow and tilted his head in the veteran's direction. "Check out Grandpa's uniform," he muttered, just loud enough for his buddies to hear. "Looks like he pulled it out of a time capsule." Cody looked up from his phone and snorted. "Man, that thing's so faded I can barely see what unit he's from. Probably got it at a surplus store." Jesse glanced over, then quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Come on, guys. He's just shopping." But Tyler was already warming to his theme. "I'm just saying, if you're going to wear the uniform, at least take care of it. That's disrespectful to everyone who serves." He said it loud enough that a few nearby shoppers turned to look. Though Marcus, now examining tomatoes 2 aisles over, gave no indication he'd heard. The 3 soldiers moved through the store, continuing their shopping, but Tyler couldn't seem to let it go. Every time he caught another glimpse of Marcus, he found something new to comment on: the outdated style of the jacket, the worn-down heels of the veteran's boots, the way he moved so slowly through the aisles. "Bet he never saw any real action." Tyler said as they waited in the checkout line. Marcus had gotten in line 3 registers over, carefully placing items on the conveyor belt. Probably spent his whole career pushing papers at some desk job, and now he wants to play dress-up. Cody laughed. But Jesse remained quiet, his discomfort growing with each comment. He'd grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about Vietnam, had seen the way the old man's hands sometimes shook when loud noises startled him. There was something about the elderly soldier's bearing, the way he stood, the careful precision of his movements, that reminded Jesse of his grandfather. Marcus finished paying for his groceries and headed toward the exit, his plastic bags hanging from one hand. The automatic doors slid open, and he stepped out into the afternoon heat. He was almost to his truck when he heard footsteps behind him. "Excuse me, sir?" The voice was young, uncertain. Marcus turned to find Jesse standing a few feet away, his two friends hanging back near the entrance, watching with expressions somewhere between curiosity and annoyance. "Yes, son." Marcus's voice was quiet, measured. Jesse hesitated, then gestured toward Marcus's uniform. "I just wanted to say, my grandfather served too, in Vietnam. He wore his uniform with pride, just like you're doing." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a brief flash of recognition, of shared understanding. "Your grandfather sounds like a good man." "He was," Jesse said. "He passed away last year?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Then he's at peace now. That's something." He shifted his grocery bag to his other hand. "You take care of yourself, Private, and thank you for your service." As Marcus climbed into his truck and drove away, Jesse walked back to where Tyler and Cody were waiting. Tyler shook his head, incredulous. "Dude, what was that about? Why are you apologizing to some old guy playing soldier?" Jesse met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't apologizing. I was showing respect." "Respect?" Tyler scoffed. "For what?" "For wearing a uniform so old it probably belongs in a museum." But Jesse didn't answer. He'd seen something in the elderly veteran's eyes that his friends had missed. A depth, a weight of experience that couldn't be faked or bought at any surplus store. Whatever Marcus Holloway's story was, Jesse suspected it was one worth hearing. The three soldiers went their separate ways after leaving the commissary, but Tyler couldn't shake his irritation. That evening, as he sat in the barracks scrolling through his phone, he kept thinking about the old man in the faded uniform. Part of him knew he'd been out of line, that his comments had been unnecessarily harsh. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it, not even to himself. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his small house on the edge of town, the grocery bag still unpacked on his kitchen counter. He'd gone straight to the spare bedroom, the one Martha had always called his memory room, and opened the old footlocker at the base of the closet. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were the medals and decorations he'd earned over 2 tours in Vietnam. He didn't take them out often. Looking at them brought back too much faces of friends who hadn't made it home. The sounds and smells of combat that still haunted his dreams 5 decades later. But there, pinned to the inside lid of the footlocker, was the one decoration he never put away, never wrapped up or hid from view. The Combat Infantry Badge, a silver musket on a blue background, simple and unassuming to those who didn't know what it meant. To those who did, it was everything. It meant you'd been there, in the mud and the blood and the chaos. It meant you'd faced the enemy and survived. Marcus traced the edge of the badge with one finger, then closed the footlocker. Tomorrow was another day. The young soldiers at the commissary would go on with their lives, probably never giving him another thought. And that was fine. He hadn't worn the uniform for their approval. He'd worn it for the brothers he'd lost, for the anniversary of a battle that had changed his life forever, for the memory of who he'd been when the uniform was new and the future felt impossible to imagine. As darkness fell over Fort Benning, 3 young soldiers and 1 old veteran went about their evenings, unaware that their paths would cross again sooner than any of them expected. 3 days after the commissary incident, Fort Benning prepared for its monthly Veterans Recognition Ceremony. The event drew crowds from across the base and the surrounding community, active duty personnel, retirees, local politicians, and families all gathered to honor those who'd served in conflicts spanning from World War II to the present day. Tyler, Cody, and Jesse found themselves assigned to ceremonial duty, much to Tyler's annoyance. Standing in formation for 2 hours under the Georgia sun wasn't his idea of a productive afternoon. The 3 of them took their positions along the parade ground's perimeter, joining dozens of other soldiers in their dress uniforms, rifles at their sides. Colonel Patricia Hendricks, the base commander, stood at the podium arranging her notes. She was a no-nonsense officer with 28 years of service, someone who'd risen through the ranks by being tougher and smarter than everyone around her. Behind her, a row of chairs held this month's honored guests, 12 veterans ranging in age from their early 50s to their late 80s, each representing a different era of American military history. Jesse scanned the seated veterans, his attention caught by a familiar figure in the second row. Marcus Holloway sat with his hands folded in his lap, wearing the same faded uniform from the commissary, though he'd added a few medals to his chest. Even from a distance, Jesse could see how the old man held himself, back straight, eyes forward, every inch a soldier despite his age. "Hey," Jesse whispered to Tyler, who stood rigidly beside him. "That's the guy from the commissary." The one in the old uniform. Tyler's eyes flicked toward the seated veterans, then back to attention. "So what? Probably got a pity invitation." Before Jesse could respond, Colonel Hendricks tapped the microphone, and the ceremony began. She spoke about sacrifice and service, about the unbroken chain connecting those who'd fought at Normandy to those currently serving in the Middle East. Her words were practiced but genuine, carrying the weight of someone who understood the cost of military service on a personal level. One by one, veterans were called to the podium to receive certificates of appreciation and commemorative coins. A Navy pilot from Desert Storm, an Army medic from Somalia, a Marine who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Each received applause, each shook the colonel's hand. Each returned to their seat with quiet dignity. Then Colonel Hendricks paused, looking down at her notes with an expression that suggested this next introduction carried special significance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Our final honoree today," she began, her voice taking on a different tone, "is someone who embodies the very essence of the Combat Infantry Badge he wears. Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. But it's not the length of his service that brings him to this stage today. It's what happened on November 19th, 1968, a date that 55 years ago this week marked one of the bloodiest battles of the Ia Drang Valley. Campaign's later operations, the crowd fell silent. Even the restless children in the back rows seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Tyler's smirk faded. Beside him, Jesse stood taller, his earlier intuition confirmed. Colonel Hendricks continued, reading from a document that Jesse realized must be Marcus's service record. Staff Sergeant Holloway's platoon was conducting a reconnaissance patrol when they encountered a North Vietnamese army force 3 times their size. In the firefight that followed, their lieutenant was killed, and their radio operator was severely wounded. Staff Sergeant Holloway, then a sergeant, took command of the remaining men, many of them injured, all of them pinned down by enemy fire. She looked up from the document, making eye contact with various members of the audience. For 6 hours, Sergeant Holloway held that position. He coordinated their defense, redistributed ammunition from the dead and wounded, called in artillery support using the damaged radio, and personally dragged 3 wounded soldiers to cover while under continuous fire. When relief finally arrived, 12 men walked out of that jungle. Without Sergeant Holloway's actions, the after-action report estimates that none would have survived. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tyler felt his face growing hot, though whether from shame or the Georgia heat, he couldn't say. Staff Sergeant Holloway was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, the colonel said. Due to what his commanding officer later called bureaucratic incompetence, that recommendation was downgraded to a Bronze Star with V device. But those who served with him, those who lived because of his courage, they know the truth of what happened that day. Marcus rose from his chair with the same careful movements Jesse had observed at the commissary. He walked to the podium, and Colonel Hendricks stepped aside to let him approach the microphone. She handed him the certificate and coin, then rendered a salute so crisp and precise it could have been used in a training manual. Marcus returned the salute, then stood at the microphone, looking out over the assembled crowd. For a long moment he said nothing, and Jesse wondered if the old veteran would speak at all. When Marcus finally did speak, His voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the parade ground with unexpected strength. I appreciate this recognition, but I want to be clear about something. I didn't do anything special that day. I did what any soldier would do, what any of you would do when your brothers need you. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. Private First Class David Chen, Specialist Robert Morrison, Lieutenant James Caldwell. Those men, and the thousands of others who gave everything, they're the ones who deserve to be standing here. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the younger soldiers in formation. I see a lot of young faces out here today. You're the same age I was when I shipped out to Vietnam. Some of you are probably thinking you know what service means, what sacrifice looks like. I thought I knew too before I saw combat. But here's what I learned in that jungle, and what I hope you never have to learn the hard way. Courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being absolutely terrified and doing your duty anyway. It's about putting your brothers before yourself. Even when every instinct screams at you to run, Tyler stared at the ground, unable to meet the old veteran's eyes even from across the parade ground. This uniform I'm wearing, Marcus continued, one hand touching his faded jacket. It's old. It's worn out. It doesn't look like much compared to your modern ACUs. But every thread in this fabric represents a memory. Every faded patch is a reminder of where I've been and what I've seen. I wear it not because I'm proud of myself, but because I'm proud to have served alongside men who were better than I could ever hope to be. He stepped back from the microphone, and the applause that followed was different from the polite recognition given to the earlier honorees. This was deeper, more visceral. People stood, and the standing ovation continued for nearly a minute as Marcus made his way back to his seat. Colonel Hendricks resumed the podium, concluding the ceremony with closing remarks, but Jesse barely heard them. His mind was replaying every snide comment from the commissary, every mocking laugh, every dismissive gesture. Beside him, Tyler stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight enough that the muscles in his neck stood out in sharp relief. As the ceremony concluded and formations were dismissed, the three young soldiers found themselves caught in the crowd, flowing toward the reception area where refreshments had been set up. Veterans mingled with active duty personnel, sharing stories and making connections across generations. Jesse spotted Marcus standing alone near the edge of the gathering, holding a cup of punch and looking somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. Before he could talk himself out of it, Jesse started walking toward the old veteran, his heart pounding harder than it had during any physical training exercise. Tyler watched him go, frozen between pride and shame, knowing he should follow but unable to make his feet move. Cody had already disappeared into the crowd, apparently content to pretend the last few days had never happened. As Jesse approached Marcus, the old veteran looked up, and recognition flickered across his weathered features. "You're the young man from the commissary." "Yes, sir," Jesse said. "Private Jesse Hartman. I just wanted to say, what you did, what the colonel talked about, I can't even imagine." Marcus took a sip of his punch. "That's good. I hope you never have to." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Jesse found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since the ceremony. "Sir, why didn't you say anything that day? When we were being disrespectful?" The old veteran considered the question, his eyes distant. "Son, I learned a long time ago that respect can't be demanded. It can only be earned. And sometimes the people who need to learn that lesson the most are the ones who have to figure it out for themselves." Jesse nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in those words, even as they made his earlier silence feel even more shameful. "My friends and I, we owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said gently. "But maybe you owe it to yourselves to think about what it really means to wear that uniform. Because someday you might be the old veteran that young soldiers look at and judge without knowing your story." As Jesse stood there absorbing those words, Tyler finally forced himself to move through the crowd, heading toward the two of them with leaden steps, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. Tyler approached with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for walking into a commander's office after a major screw-up. His dress uniform suddenly felt too tight around his collar, and the Georgia afternoon seemed hotter than it had been just minutes before. As he drew closer, Marcus turned to acknowledge him, and Tyler found himself looking into eyes that had seen things he couldn't begin to comprehend. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," Tyler began, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm Private First Class Tyler Brennan. I was at the commissary the other day." Marcus studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I remember." The simple acknowledgement hit Tyler harder than any reprimand would have. The old man had heard everything, had known exactly what they were saying about him, and had chosen to walk away with dignity intact. "Sir, I need to apologize," Tyler continued, the words coming faster now. "The things I said, the way I acted, there's no excuse for it. I was completely out of line." Cody materialized from the crowd at that moment, apparently having worked up his own courage. He positioned himself next to Tyler, his face flushed. "I was part of it too, sir. I'm sorry." Marcus took another sip of his punch, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make both young soldiers squirm. When he finally spoke, his tone was neither angry nor dismissive, just matter of fact. "You boys know what that badge means?" He gestured to the Combat Infantry Badge on his chest. "The one you can actually see, unlike all these faded patches you were laughing about." Tyler and Cody shook their heads, though Jesse, standing beside Marcus, spoke up quietly. "It means you've been in ground combat, sir. Infantry against the enemy." "That's right," Marcus confirmed. "It's not given for time served or training completed. You earn it by being there when the bullets are flying, when mortars are dropping, when the person next to you might not make it to tomorrow." He paused, his gaze moving from Tyler to Cody and back again. "Every soldier who wears this badge has a story. Some stories end better than others." A woman in her mid-50s approached the group, her hand gently touching Marcus's arm. "Dad, I've been looking everywhere for you. The photographer wants to get some shots of all the honorees together." Marcus smiled at her, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Boys, this is my daughter, Rebecca." Rebecca, these young men were just introducing themselves. Rebecca Holloway had her father's sharp eyes and carried herself with the confidence of someone used to managing difficult situations. She shook hands with each of the soldiers, her grip firm and professional. "It's nice to meet you all. Are you stationed here at Benning?" "Yes, ma'am," Jesse replied. "We're with the 198th Infantry Brigade, going through advanced training." "Infantry," she said, glancing at her father with a knowing look. "Dad must have been giving you the speech about the Combat Infantry Badge." "Something like that," Marcus said dryly. "Though I think these young men have heard enough of my war stories for one day." "I doubt that," Rebecca said. "You always leave out the best parts." She turned to the soldiers. "Did he tell you about the time he carried Sergeant Willis for 3 miles through the jungle with a bullet in his own leg?" Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "That's not relevant. Or the time he talked down a new lieutenant who was about to order the platoon into an ambush. Rebecca, or how he spent 6 months writing letters to the families of every man in his platoon who didn't make it home, making sure they knew their sons and husbands died as heroes." Tyler felt something tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a veteran with an old uniform. This was someone who'd lived the values that Tyler had only read about in leadership manuals. The photographer called out again, more insistently this time, and Rebecca gave her father a gentle push toward the gathering group of veterans. "Go on, I'll keep these soldiers company for a minute." As Marcus walked away, Rebecca turned to face the 3 young men with an expression that was somehow both warm and challenging. "I'm going to tell you something my father would never say himself. That uniform he wears, it's the same one he was wearing when he came home from his 2nd tour. He has a newer one in his closet, perfectly preserved, but he chooses to wear that one on special occasions." "Do you know why?" The 3 soldiers shook their heads. "Because it's real," she said simply. "Every stain, every fade, every worn thread, it's all part of the story. He doesn't wear it to impress anyone or to show off. He wears it because when he puts it on, he's carrying his brothers with him. The ones who didn't get to come home and have daughters or grow old or stand at ceremonies like this. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photos, then turned the screen to show them a black and white image of a young Marcus in pristine uniform, his face unlined and his eyes bright with youth. Next to him stood a group of soldiers, all of them grinning at the camera with the invincibility of young men who couldn't imagine their own mortality. "That was taken 3 weeks before the battle the colonel mentioned," Rebecca said. "Out of the 15 men in that photo, 6 made it home. My father has nightmares about the other 9 to this day. Some nights I can hear him in his room talking to them in his sleep." Cody looked away, blinking rapidly. Tyler stared at the photo, trying to reconcile the vibrant young soldier with the quiet old man who'd endured their mockery without complaint. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse," Rebecca continued, tucking her phone away. "I'm telling you because my father won't, and because you need to understand something. Every veteran you see, whether they're wearing a uniform or not, whether they look the part or not, they've all got a story. And you don't get to decide whose story is worth respecting based on how shiny their buttons are." Jesse found his voice first. "Ma'am, is there any way we could make this right, beyond just apologizing?" Rebecca considered the question, then smiled slightly. "You really want to make it right? My father volunteers at the VA hospital every Tuesday and Thursday, visiting veterans who don't get many visitors. Most of them are from Vietnam or Korea. Some of them don't even have family anymore. He sits with them, listens to their stories, helps them write letters, plays chess. He's been doing it for 20 years. She paused, letting that sink in. "You want to make amends? Show up. Not once for show, but regularly. Learn from the people who've actually been there. That's how you honor the uniform you're wearing." The photographer finished with the veterans, and Marcus returned to the group, his expression curious at the serious faces surrounding his daughter. "Everything all right here?" "Fine, Dad," Rebecca said, squeezing his arm. "I was just telling these soldiers about your volunteer work." Marcus shot her a look that suggested this wasn't information he'd have volunteered himself, but he didn't contradict her. Instead, he turned to the young men with a question in his eyes. Tyler took a breath, making a decision that surprised even himself. "Sir, if you wouldn't mind, we'd like to join you sometime. At the VA hospital. If that's allowed." "You sure about that?" Marcus asked, studying Tyler's face. "It's not glamorous work. Mostly just sitting and listening. Sometimes helping with wheelchairs or reading to guys whose eyes aren't what they used to be." "I'm sure," Tyler said, and he meant it. Beside him, Cody and Jesse nodded their agreement. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of it. "All right then. Tuesday afternoon, 1400 hours. Building 7 at the VA hospital on Marshall Road. Don't be late." "We won't be." "Sir," Jesse promised, as other people moved in to speak with Marcus. The 3 young soldiers found themselves drifting back toward the parking area. They walked in silence for a while, each processing the afternoon's revelations in their own way. Finally, Cody spoke up. "Man, I feel like an absolute idiot." "That makes 2 of us," Tyler admitted. "I kept thinking about how he must be some poser, some guy who wanted attention. I couldn't have been more wrong." Jesse kicked at a loose stone on the pavement. "My grandfather used to say that real warriors don't need to advertise. They just are." "Your grandfather was right," Tyler said. He stopped walking and turned to face his friends. "Look, Tuesday at the VA, I'm going. Not because I have to, but because I want to. This thing with Staff Sergeant Holloway, it showed me something I needed to see." "What's that?" Cody asked. Tyler struggled to put it into words. "That respect isn't about rank or age or how impressive someone looks in formation. It's about recognizing the weight that people carry, even when you can't see it. Especially when you can't see it." The 3 of them continued walking, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Behind them, the veterans' recognition ceremony was winding down. But for Tyler, Cody, and Jesse, something new was just beginning. A lesson in humility that would stay with them long after their own uniforms had faded and worn. Marcus watched them go from across the lawn, Rebecca standing beside him. "Think they'll show up on Tuesday?" she asked. "The quiet one will," Marcus said, meaning Jesse. "As for the other two—" He shrugged. "Time will tell. But at least they're thinking about it now. That's more than they were doing 3 days ago." "You're too forgiving," Rebecca said. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "Or maybe I just remember being young and stupid enough to think I knew everything. We all need someone to set us straight eventually. If it takes an old man in a faded uniform to do it, so be it." Tuesday arrived with overcast skies threatening rain. Tyler stood outside Building 7 at the VA hospital, checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. It was 13:55 hours, 5 minutes early. He'd debated wearing civilian clothes, but ultimately decided on his duty uniform, freshly pressed and properly fitted. If nothing else, he wanted to show that he was taking this seriously. Jesse arrived next, pulling into the parking lot on his motorcycle. He'd traded his usual confident stride for something more subdued, glancing up at the hospital building with visible apprehension. "Cody's not coming," he said as he approached Tyler. "He texted me this morning. Said something came up." Tyler wasn't surprised, though disappointment flickered across his face. "Guess it's just us then. You think Staff Sergeant Holloway expected all 3 of us to bail?" Jesse asked. "Probably," Tyler admitted. "Which means we're here to prove him wrong." At precisely 1400 hours, Marcus's truck pulled into the lot. The old veteran climbed out, wearing khaki pants and a simple button-down shirt. Without his uniform, he looked like any other retiree, except for the bearing, the way he carried himself that marked him as military even in civilian clothes. "Afternoon. Soldiers?" Marcus greeted them, his tone neutral. His gaze swept the parking lot, noting the absence of the 3rd member of their group, but he made no comment on it. "Follow me." They entered through the main doors, and Tyler was immediately struck by the smell, not unpleasant, but distinctly institutional. Antiseptic mixed with floor polish and something else he couldn't quite identify. The lobby was spacious and well lit, with volunteers manning an information desk and visitors moving through with varying degrees of purpose. Marcus signed them in at the desk, introducing Tyler and Jesse to the elderly woman working there. "Margaret, these 2 are going to be helping out today. Can you get them visitor badges?" Margaret peered at them over her reading glasses, her expression warming. "More young folks helping out?" "Marcus, you're performing miracles. We need all the hands we can get." She processed their IDs and handed them temporary badges. "You boys stick close to Marcus. He knows everyone in this place, and everyone knows him." They took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and Marcus led them down a hallway lined with rooms. Through open doors, Tyler caught glimpses of elderly men in various states, some watching television, others sleeping, a few staring out windows at the grey sky beyond. "This wing is for long-term care patients," Marcus explained as they walked. "Most of these men have been here for months, some for years. They've got medical issues that require constant monitoring, but they're still sharp mentally. That's almost harder, being trapped in a failing body while your mind stays clear." He stopped at a door marked 307 and knocked gently. "Frank, you decent?" "Do I have a choice?" Came a raspy voice from inside. Marcus smiled and pushed the door open. The room was small, but personalized. Photos covering one wall, a bookshelf crammed with paperbacks, and a wheelchair positioned near the window. In the hospital bed sat a man who might have been anywhere from 70 to 90, thin as a rail with sharp eyes that immediately focused on the 2 young soldiers. Frank Delgado. "Meet Private First Class Tyler Brennan and Private Jesse Hartman," Marcus said. "They're going to be visiting with us today." Frank's gaze moved between them, assessing. "Infantry?" "Yes, sir," Jesse replied. "Good. Navy boys never understand the real stories." Frank's grin showed he was joking, mostly. "Pull up those chairs and sit down. Marcus, you bringing me new audience members?" "I'm flattered." Marcus settled into the chair closest to Frank's bed with the ease of long familiarity. "I thought they could use some education. Plus, you love having people to complain to." "Damn right I do," Frank said. He looked at Tyler and Jesse. "You boys know anything about Chosin Reservoir?" Tyler shook his head, but Jesse spoke up. Korea, sir. 1950. One of the worst battles of the war. One of the coldest, too, Frank said. 30 below zero. Chinese came at us in waves, thousands of them. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing to death. He paused, his eyes distant. I was 19 years old. About your age, I'd guess. Thought I was invincible, right up until the moment I realized I might not see my 20th birthday. For the next hour, Frank talked. Not in the polished way of official histories, but in the raw, unfiltered voice of someone who'd been there. He described the numbing cold that made weapons malfunction, the impossible decisions made by officers barely older than their men, the buddy who'd saved his life by giving him the last of his rations, even though they were both starving. Tyler found himself leaning forward, captivated despite the heavy subject matter. This wasn't like any history class he'd ever sat through. This was real, delivered by someone whose hands still bore the scars of frostbite 73 years later. Marcus interjected occasionally with questions that kept Frank's narrative focused, and Tyler realized this was a practiced routine between them. They'd done this dance many times before, with Marcus guiding the conversation to help Frank share his story without getting lost in painful details. When Frank finally wound down, Marcus checked his watch. We should let you rest. Doctor's orders, remember? To hell with doctors, Frank grumbled, but his exhaustion was evident. You boys come back sometime. I've got plenty more stories. We will, sir, Jesse promised, and Tyler nodded his agreement. They visited 3 more veterans that afternoon. Each one had a different story, a different war, a different set of scars. William Chen had flown helicopters in Vietnam, evacuating wounded soldiers under heavy fire. His room was filled with model aircraft that he built with trembling hands, fighting against the Parkinsons that had slowly stolen his fine motor control. Gregory Pierce had served in the First Gulf War as a tank commander, and his stories carried a different flavor, high-tech warfare punctuated by moments of pure chaos. And then there was Samuel Richardson, a World War II veteran at 98 years old, who spoke in whispers about landing at Normandy on D-Day +3. Each visit followed a similar pattern. Marcus would make introductions, engage the veteran in conversation, and subtly guide Tyler and Jesse into participating. Sometimes the young soldiers just listened. Other times they asked questions. Always they showed respect. By the time they left the hospital at 1700 hours, Tyler felt mentally exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical training. They walked to the parking lot in silence, processing everything they'd heard. Marcus stopped at his truck and turned to face them. So, what did you learn today? Tyler struggled to articulate the swirl of emotions and thoughts in his head. That every one of those men has lived through things I can't even imagine. And that they're still here, still fighting in their own way. Jesse, Marcus prompted. That listening is sometimes more important than talking, Jesse said. And that history isn't just dates and battles in a textbook. It's people. Real people with families and fears and courage they probably didn't know they had until they needed it. Marcus nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with their answers. Frank mentioned something to me while you were helping Mr. Chen with his models. He said you boys reminded him of his grandson, eager, respectful, willing to learn. That's high praise coming from Frank. He doesn't suffer fools. Will you be back on Thursday? Tyler asked, and was mildly surprised to find that he genuinely hoped the answer was yes. Every Tuesday and Thursday, like clockwork, Marcus confirmed. You're welcome to join me anytime. No obligation, no pressure. But if you do come back, be prepared to work. There's always wheelchairs to push, books to read to guys whose eyesight is failing, or just company to keep for men who don't get visitors anymore. We'll be here, Tyler said firmly. Jesse nodded his agreement. As they parted ways, Tyler sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine. His phone showed a text from Cody. How'd it go? Tyler stared at the message, considering his response. Finally, he typed, You missed out. Thursday at 1400, you should come. The response came quickly. Maybe. Tyler pocketed his phone and started his car. Maybe it was better than no. And if Cody didn't show up, that was his loss. Tyler was beginning to understand something that he wished someone had taught him earlier, that the real measure of a soldier wasn't in how sharp his uniform looked or how many push-ups he could do. It was in moments like these, sitting with old warriors who'd already fought their battles and won the only victory that truly mattered: survival. As he drove back to base, Tyler thought about Marcus in that faded uniform at the commissary, bearing their mockery with quiet dignity. He thought about Frank and his stories of Korea, about William and his shaking hands building perfect model helicopters, about Samuel who'd stormed a beach at 18 years. Holden somehow lived to be 98, and he thought about the Combat Infantry Badge on Marcus's chest, that simple silver musket that represented something he was only beginning to understand. Not glory or heroism in the Hollywood sense, but something deeper and more profound. The unbreakable bond forged between soldiers who'd stood together when everything else fell apart. Thursday couldn't come soon enough. Thursday morning broke clear and cold. The kind of November day that made Tyler grateful for his jacket as he walked across the base. He'd woken up before his alarm, thoughts already turning to the afternoon's visit to the VA hospital. Something had shifted in him since Tuesday, a restlessness that had nothing to do with his usual ambitions of promotion or recognition. This was different. This mattered in a way he was still learning to articulate. At breakfast in the dining facility, he spotted Cody sitting alone at a corner table, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without much interest. Tyler grabbed his tray and headed over, sliding into the seat across from him. "You coming today?" Tyler asked without preamble. Cody looked up, his expression guarded. "I don't know, man. I've got some things to take care of." "What things?" "Just things," Cody set down his fork. "Look, I get what you're trying to do. The whole redemption arc, making amends, whatever. But sitting around listening to old guys talk about wars that happened before we were born, I don't see how that fixes anything." Tyler leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. "You remember what you said at the commissary? About Staff Sergeant Holloway probably never seeing real action?" Cody's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I was wrong. We established that." "No, we didn't just establish that. We proved to ourselves that we don't know anything," Tyler said quietly. "I spent Tuesday afternoon listening to a 98-year-old man describe what it was like to wade through water on Omaha Beach while machine gun fire cut down the guys next to him. He was 18 years old, Cody, younger than we are now. And when he finished telling me about watching his sergeant's head get blown off by artillery, you know what he said? He apologized for getting too graphic." Cody stared at his tray, saying nothing. "This isn't about redemption," Tyler continued. "It's about education. Real education, not the sanitized version they give us in briefings. These guys, they're living history, and they won't be around forever." He paused. "Frank, the Korean War vet I met, he told Marcus that his grandson hasn't visited in 3 years. 3 years, man. And he sits in that room every day hoping someone will remember he exists." "That's depressing as hell," Cody muttered. "Yeah, it is. Which is exactly why we should be there." Tyler stood, picking up his tray. 1,400 hours, Building 7. Your choice." He walked away before Cody could respond, leaving his friend to wrestle with his own conscience. Jesse met him outside the dining facility, already changed into a fresh uniform. "Think he'll show?" Jesse asked, falling into step beside Tyler. "Honestly, I have no idea. But I'm done trying to convince people to do the right thing. Either you get it or you don't." The morning passed in the usual blur of training exercises and equipment maintenance. Tyler found his attention wandering during a lecture on tactical communications, his mind drifting to Frank's descriptions of fighting in Korea with radio equipment that barely worked in the freezing temperatures. The instructor's clinical explanations of signal degradation and atmospheric interference seemed pale and bloodless compared to Frank's story of a radio man who'd died trying to call in air support with equipment that failed. At the worst possible moment, at 13 to 30 hours, Tyler and Jesse met at the parking lot. As they were about to leave, a familiar figure jogged toward them, Cody, slightly out of breath, his uniform showing signs of having been thrown on in a hurry. "I'm coming," Cody announced. "But if this is some kind of guilt trip—" "It's not," Tyler interrupted. "It's just listening. That's all." The three of them drove to the VA hospital in Tyler's car, the conversation light and deliberately avoiding the weight of what they were about to do. But as they pulled into the parking lot and saw Marcus's truck already there, the mood sobered. Marcus was waiting in the lobby, chatting with Margaret at the information desk. When he spotted the three young soldiers approaching, something like approval flickered across his weathered features. "All three of you," he observed. "That's good. We've got a full afternoon planned." After getting Cody his visitor badge, Marcus led them upstairs, but this time they bypassed the third floor entirely, heading instead to the fifth. The atmosphere here was different, quieter, more subdued. Tyler noticed that several rooms had their doors closed, and the nurses moved with a careful gentleness that suggested fragility. "Hospice wing," Marcus said quietly, reading their expressions. "Not all the men we visit are getting better. Some of them are at the end of their road, and they know it. These visits are different. You don't ask as many questions. Mostly you just be present." He stopped at room 512 and knocked softly before entering. The man in the bed was impossibly thin, his skin almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. But his eyes were clear and sharp, tracking their movement as they filed into the room. "Marcus," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You brought reinforcements." "Always do, Albert," Marcus replied, settling into the chair beside the bed with practiced ease. "This is Tyler, Jesse, and Cody. They're infantry, training at Benning." Albert Wilson had served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne. The photos on his windowsill showed a younger version of him in jump gear, grinning at the camera with the fearlessness of youth. Now at 76, cancer was winning a battle that bullets and Agent Orange had failed to finish. "Airborne," Albert said to the young soldiers. "You guys jump yet?" "Not yet, sir," Jesse replied. "That's next month." "Scary as hell the first time," Albert said with a ghost of a smile. "But there's nothing like it. Floating down, watching the ground come up to meet you, knowing that you're trusting your life to a piece of silk and some rope." He paused to catch his breath. "Of course, the landing was always the hard part. I broke my ankle on my fourth jump. Stupid mistake, didn't keep my feet together. But I healed up and got back in the air." For the next 30 minutes, Albert talked about his experiences in Vietnam. But unlike the previous veterans they'd met, Albert's stories had an urgency to them, as though he knew his time for telling them was running short. He spoke about the brotherhood of paratroopers, about jumping into hot landing zones, about the buddies he'd lost and the ones who'd saved his life. Marcus guided the conversation with the skill of long practice, knowing when to prompt Albert with questions and when to let the silence breathe. Tyler, Cody, and Jesse listened, absorbing not just the words, but the emotion behind them, the pride, the sorrow, the unresolved grief that even 50 years couldn't completely heal. When Albert's energy began to flag, a nurse appeared in the doorway, giving Marcus a meaningful look. "Time to go." "We'll come back soon, Albert," Marcus promised, standing carefully. "You better," Albert replied, his eyes already drifting closed. "I've got more stories to tell, and I'm running out of time to tell them." Outside in the hallway, the three young soldiers stood in heavy silence. Marcus let them process for a moment before speaking. "Albert's doctors give him another 2 weeks, maybe 3. He knows it. His daughter visits when she can, but she lives in Oregon and has her own family. Most days, the only visitors he gets are the nurses and me." "That's not right," Cody said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "He served his country, he sacrificed, and he's dying alone in a hospital room." "Welcome to reality," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Not every veteran gets a hero's farewell. Most of them just fade away, and the world keeps spinning. That's why this matters, why showing up matters. You boys being here today, that means something to men like Albert. It means someone from the next generation cares enough to listen, to remember, to carry these stories forward. They visited 2 more rooms on the hospice floor, a Marine from Iwo Jima who could barely speak but whose eyes lit up at the sight of young soldiers in uniform, and a Navy corpsman who'd served with the Marines in Vietnam and still woke up screaming from nightmares about the wounded men he couldn't save. By the time they finished, it was after 1,700 hours. The emotional weight of the afternoon hung heavy on all 3 young soldiers as they walked back to the parking lot. The November sun was setting earlier now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marcus stopped at his truck, turning to face them. "I want to show you boys something, if you've got time." They exchanged glances and nodded. "We've got time," Tyler said. "Follow me," Marcus instructed, climbing into his truck. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a small park on the outskirts of Columbus. At its center stood a memorial, a simple granite wall engraved with names. Marcus led them to it, his hands in his pockets, his gaze distant. "This is the local Vietnam Veterans Memorial," he said. 43 names on this wall. All local boys who didn't come home." His finger traced one name near the top. "David Chen. He was the first one I lost. Took shrapnel from a mortar around 3 weeks into our first tour. Died in my arms, waiting for the medevac." He moved down the wall, touching each name as he spoke. "Robert Morrison. James Caldwell." Marcus talked about them at the ceremony. "But there are others." His finger stopped on another name. "Thomas Wright. Best point man I ever knew. Could sense an ambush like he had a 6th sense. Stepped on a mine, clearing a trail for the rest of us." Tyler, Jesse, and Cody stood silent, watching as Marcus worked his way down the wall, reciting names and brief stories. Each name represented a life cut short, a family forever changed, a future that never had the chance to unfold. "This is why I wear that faded uniform," Marcus said finally, turning to face them. "Every time I put it on, I'm carrying these men with me. The patches may be worn, the fabric may be thin, but that doesn't diminish what it represents. If anything, the wear makes it more real, more honest." "Sir," Jesse said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Do you ever regret it? Serving, I mean. Knowing what you know now, seeing what you've seen, would you do it again?" Marcus considered the question for a long moment, his eyes on the memorial wall. "That's complicated. Do I wish I'd never had to see my friends die? Absolutely. Do I wish I'd never had to kill another human being? Every day of my life. But do I regret serving? No, because if men like me hadn't gone, other men would have had to. And maybe they wouldn't have made the choices I made, or saved the people I saved. You don't get to choose the hand history deals you. You only get to choose how you play it." He turned back to them, and in the fading light, Tyler could see every year of those 7 decades etched into his face. "You boys are at the beginning of your journey. You might see combat, you might not. You might serve 20 years or 4. But whatever happens, remember this: the uniform you wear is a privilege, not a right. It's been worn by men who stormed beaches and froze in foxholes and jumped out of perfectly good airplanes. It's been worn by heroes and cowards and everything in between. What matters is that when your time comes, whatever form that takes, you honor the legacy of everyone who wore it before you." Cody stepped forward, his usual bravado completely stripped away. "Staff Sergeant Holloway, I want to apologize again. Not just for what I said at the commissary, but for my whole attitude. I thought I knew what it meant to be a soldier. I thought it was about being tough and looking good and earning respect. But I was wrong. It's about this." He gestured at the memorial. "It's about carrying something bigger than yourself." "That's a good start," Marcus said. "Understanding is the first step. Living it is what comes next." As darkness settled over the park, the 4 of them stood before the memorial wall, each lost in their own thoughts. Tyler found himself reading the names, trying to imagine the stories behind each one. How many of them had been 19 or 20, barely older than he was now? How many had left behind parents, siblings, girlfriends, children they'd never meet? "Sir," Tyler said eventually, "would it be okay if we came back here?" "To this memorial?" "Any time you want," Marcus replied. "I come here myself once a month, usually on the anniversary of the battle where I lost the most men. Sometimes I just sit here and talk to them, tell them about what's happening in the world they never got to see." Probably sounds crazy. It doesn't sound crazy at all, Jesse said firmly. They stayed a while longer until the cold became too much to ignore. As they walked back to their vehicles, Marcus stopped them one more time. "You boys did good today," he said. "Albert noticed. Frank will be asking about you next Tuesday. And those other men we visited, they don't get a lot of young visitors. You made their week just by showing up and treating them with dignity. We'll be back," Tyler promised. "Tuesday and Thursday, as long as we're stationed here." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I'm going to hold you to that. And bring other soldiers if you can. The more young people who understand what these veterans have to teach, the better off we'll all be." Driving back to base, the three young soldiers rode in contemplative silence. The radio was off, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional whoosh of passing traffic. Finally, Cody spoke from the back seat. "I keep thinking about Albert," he said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And then another name on another wall somewhere. "That's why we have to listen while we can," Jesse replied. "Every story he tells, every memory he shares, that's something that would be lost forever if nobody cared enough to hear it." Tyler gripped the steering wheel, his mind replaying the afternoon's experiences. "You know what gets me? We almost didn't do this. We almost just let our pride and our ignorance keep us from learning something important. If Staff Sergeant Holloway had been a different kind of man, if he'd gotten angry at us at the commissary or reported us or just written us off as stupid kids, we never would have had this opportunity. He gave us grace," Jesse said, "even when we didn't deserve it." "Yeah," Tyler agreed. "And now we need to pay that forward." The following Tuesday, 6 soldiers showed up at the VA hospital. Tyler, Jesse, and Cody had each brought one other person from their unit. Young men and women who'd heard about the visits and wanted to be part of something meaningful. Marcus raised an eyebrow when he saw the crowd, but didn't comment beyond a simple nod of approval. They split up, visiting different wings, different veterans, spreading out to cover more ground. Tyler found himself sitting with Frank again, this time with a female private named Sarah Chen. No relation to David Chen, but the name gave Frank pause nonetheless. "You know," Frank said to Tyler as the afternoon wound down, "when Marcus first started bringing young soldiers around, I thought it was charity. Old man doing his good deed, kids putting in time to look good on their service records. But you're different. You actually care." "I do, sir," Tyler replied honestly. "You all have something we need: perspective, experience, wisdom earned the hard way." Frank reached out with a trembling hand and gripped Tyler's arm with surprising strength. "Then you listen good, son. And when you're my age, sitting in a room like this, you pass it on to the next generation. That's how the chain stays unbroken. That's how we ensure that the sacrifices mean something." "I will, sir. I promise." Over the following months, those Tuesday and Thursday visits became a fixture in Tyler's life. His initial group of 6 grew to 12, then 20. The base commander heard about it and commended the initiative during a formation. Other units started their own veteran visitation programs, inspired by the example, but for Tyler, Jesse, and Cody, it remained personal. They'd formed bonds with the men they visited, Frank with his career stories, William and his model helicopters, Gregory and his tales of desert warfare, Samuel and his fading memories of a beach in Normandy, and Albert, who passed away 3 weeks after their first visit, but not before sharing his stories with a room full of young soldiers who promised to remember. 6 months after the commissary incident, Tyler received orders for his first deployment. The night before he left, he drove to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the park. Marcus was already there, sitting on a bench in front of the wall, his faded uniform jacket draped over his shoulders against the evening chill. "Figured you might show up," Marcus said, as Tyler approached. "Heading out tomorrow," Tyler confirmed. "Wanted to come here first." They sat in silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, Tyler spoke. "I wanted to thank you, sir, for what you taught me. About respect, about service, about what this uniform really means." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "You learned that yourself." "I just gave you the opportunity." "You gave me more than that," Tyler insisted. "You showed me what kind of soldier I want to be. Not the loudest or the most decorated, but the kind who honors the legacy, the kind who remembers." "Then you're already on the right path," Marcus said. He stood, extending his hand. "You be safe out there, Tyler. Come back with more stories to tell." Tyler shook his hand, feeling the calloused palm, the firm grip of a man who'd once carried wounded soldiers through a jungle. "I will, sir. And when I do, first place I'm coming is the VA hospital. We'll be waiting," Marcus promised. As Tyler walked back to his car, he glanced back one more time at the old veteran standing before the memorial wall, silhouetted against the darkening sky. In that moment, Tyler understood something fundamental, that the Combat Infantry Badge wasn't just a piece of metal pinned to a uniform. It was a symbol of shared sacrifice, of bonds forged in impossible circumstances, of the unbroken chain connecting one generation of warriors to the next. And somewhere in the distance, between that faded uniform at the commissary and this quiet moment at the memorial, Tyler had become part of that chain. Not through combat or heroics, but through the simple act of listening, learning, and carrying forward the stories of those who'd gone before. The old uniform might have been faded and worn, but the legacy it represented would endure as long as young soldiers like Tyler chose to honor it, not with mockery or judgment, but with respect, humility, and the recognition that every veteran, regardless of how they looked, carried stories worth preserving. Marcus watched Tyler's taillights disappear into the night, then turned back to the memorial wall. His fingers found David Chen's name in the darkness, tracing the letters he'd memorized decades ago. "They're good kids, David," he said quietly to the engraved stone. "They're going to be all right." And in the gentle November breeze that rustled through the park, carrying the first hints of winter, Marcus could almost believe that his old friend was listening, proud that the lessons paid for in blood were still being passed down, still being honored, still making a difference. 50 years after they'd been learned in the jungles of Vietnam. The Combat Infantry Badge on Marcus's chest caught the moonlight. As he turned to leave, a simple silver musket that represented everything that mattered, everything that endured, everything worth fighting for, not glory. Not recognition, just the unbreakable bond between soldiers, past and present, united in service to something greater than themselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.